The USS Shah explodes after being hit by bombs during the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in this December 7, 1941 photo. The American people were shocked, bewildered, surprised, and angered by the attack. Japanese pilots get instructions aboard an aircraft carrier before the attack on Pearl Harbor, in this scene from a Japanese newsreel. It was obtained by the U.S. War Department and released to U.S. newsreels. On December 8, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress in the Capitol, his words broadcast on radio to the nation. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The Japanese aircraft carrier Ikkaku, seen in September of 1941. The Ikkaku would soon sail toward Hawaii, one of 6 aircraft carriers used in the attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japanese pilots get instructions aboard an aircraft carrier before the attack on Pearl Harbor, in this scene from a Japanese newsreel. Aircraft prepare to launch from the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier Ikkaku during the December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was obtained by the U. This photograph, from a Japanese film later captured by American forces, was taken aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Ikkaku, just as an Akajima Kate B-5N bomber launched off the deck to attack Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941. Aerial view of the initial blows struck against American ships, as seen from a Japanese plane over Pearl Harbor. War Department and released to U. Captured Japanese photograph taken during the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. In the distance, the smoke rises from Hickam Field. Seen from a distance, the battleship Arizona burns as it sinks in Pearl Harbor after the December 7, 1941 raid by Japanese bombers. Newsreels. A Japanese bomber, its diving flaps down, was photographed by a U.S. Navy photographer as the plane approached its Pearl Harbor objective on December 7. In his address, Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war against Japan, which it did that day. Japanese aircraft can be seen in the air above Pearl Harbor, top center and upper right, in this captured Japanese photograph taken during the initial moments of the Japanese attack. 3 days later, Japan's allies Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and Congress reciprocated the same day. American ships burned during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941. All previous domestic opposition to U.S. entry into the war ceased. A wide-angle view of the sky above Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, filled with smoke and anti-aircraft fire on December 7, 1941. The United States was now immersed in a war it would conduct simultaneously in Europe and the Pacific. Officers' wives, investigating explosions and seeing a smoke pall in distance on December 7, 1941, heard neighbor Mary Naden, then an army hostess who took this picture, exclaim, "There are red circles on those planes overhead. They are Japanese." Realizing war had come, the 2 women, stunned, started toward quarters. The Japanese government decided to attack Pearl Harbor after the United States cut off U.S. oil exports to Japan in the summer of 1941. Aerial photograph, taken by a Japanese pilot, of the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Japanese bomber in lower right foreground. Japan relied on the United States for 80% of its oil, and without U.S. oil supplies its navy would be unable to function. Sailors stand among wrecked airplanes at Ford Island Naval Air Station as they watch the explosion of the USS Shah in the background during the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 7, 1941. In attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese hoped to cripple or destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet so that the Japanese Navy would have freer reign in the Pacific. A U.S. flag flies from the stern of the sunken battleship USS West Virginia after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. The Japanese aircraft carrier Ikkaku, seen in September of 1941. An A-6M-20 fighter aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy carrier Ikkaku during the Pearl Harbor attack mission. The Ikkaku would soon sail toward Hawaii, one of 6 aircraft carriers used in the attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The USS Shah burns in Pearl Harbor. Japanese bombers hit the forward portion of the ship with 3 bombs. The resulting fires proved uncontrollable, and Shah was ordered abandoned. Soon after, her forward ammunition magazines detonated in a spectacular blast, completely removing her bow. Japan was also motivated strategically by ideas of creating an Asian co-prosperity sphere, Asia for Asians, in which Japan would take over the Asian colonial holdings of Europe and the United States. The USS California sinks into the mud of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. With the British, French, and Dutch caught up in the war in Europe, the Japanese believed the European powers would be unable to defend their Asian colonial holdings. A small boat rescues a USS West Virginia crew member from the water after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941. 2 men can be seen on the superstructure, upper center. The mast of the USS Tennessee is beyond the burning West Virginia. Indeed, in the 8 hours following the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan also attacked British-held Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaya, and the U.S. territorial possessions of the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. The forward magazines of USS Arizona explode after she was hit by a Japanese bomb on December 7, 1941. Frame clipped from a color motion picture taken from on board USS Solace. While the attack accomplished its intended objective, it turned out to be largely unnecessary. Japanese planes over Hawaii during the attack on Pearl Harbor are shown in this scene from a Japanese newsreel. The film was obtained by the U.S. War Department and later released to U.S. newsreels. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, who conceived the original plan, the U. Sailors at Naval Air Station, Uss, California attempt to salvage a burning PBY Catalina in the aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The battleships West Virginia and Tennessee burning after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Navy had decided as far back as 1935 to abandon charging across the Pacific towards the Philippines in response to an outbreak of war. Oil burns on the waters of Pearl Harbor, near the Naval Air Station, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The USS Maryland, a battleship moored inboard of the USS Oklahoma, which capsized, was damaged slightly in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The battleship USS Arizona belches smoke as it topples over into the sea during a Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Instead adopted Plan Dog in 1940, which emphasized keeping the IJN out of the eastern Pacific and away from the shipping lanes to Australia, while the White House reporters dash for the telephones on December 7, 1941, after they had been told by Presidential Press Secretary Stephen T. Early that Japanese submarines and planes had just bombed the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Selling papers on December 7, 1941 at Times Square in New York City, announcing that Japan has attacked U.S. bases in the Pacific, concentrated on defeating Nazi Germany. Declaring Japan guilty of a dastardly unprovoked attack, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on December 8, 1941. Listening are Vice President Henry Wallace, left, and House Speaker Sam Rayburn. Fortunately for the United States, the American aircraft carriers were untouched by the Japanese attack. Otherwise, the Pacific Fleet's ability to conduct offensive operations would have been crippled for a year or more, given no diversions from the Atlantic Fleet. President Roosevelt signs the declaration of war following the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor at the White House in Washington, District of Columbia, on December 8, 1941. As it was, the elimination of the battleships left the young Japanese Americans, including several Army selectees, gather around a reporter's car in the Japanese section of San Francisco on December 8, 1941. The minilayer USS Oglala lies capsized after being attacked by Japanese aircraft and submarines in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Navy with no choice but to rely on its aircraft carriers and submarines, the very weapons with which the heavy damage is seen on the destroyers USS Downes and USS Cassin, stationed at Pearl Harbor after the Japanese attack on the Hawaiian island on December 7, 1941. An interior shot of a destroyed aircraft hangar at Wheeler Field in Hawaii on December 11, 1941. Navy halted and eventually reversed the Japanese advance. In this photo provided by the U.S. Navy, 8 miles from Pearl Harbor, shrapnel from a Japanese bomb riddled this car and killed 3 civilians in the attack of December 7, 1941. 2 of the victims can be seen in the front seat. The Navy reported there was no nearby military target. While 6 of the 8 battleships were repaired and returned to service, their relatively low speed and high fuel consumption limited their deployment, and they served mainly in shore bombardment roles, their only major action being the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944. Wreckage of the first Japanese plane shot down during the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. A major flaw of Japanese strategic thinking was a belief that the ultimate Pacific battle would be fought by battleships, in keeping with the doctrine of Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. A Japanese midget submarine, part of the attacking force on Pearl Harbor, beached at Bellows Field. As a result, Yamamoto and his successors hearted battleships for a decisive battle that never happened. A small crowd inspects the damage, both inside and outside, after a Japanese bomb hit the residence of Pulgu during the Japanese air raid on December 7, 1941. Photo credit, U. Unidentified attaches of the Japanese consulate began burning papers, ledgers and other records shortly after Japan went to war against the U.S. on December 7, 1941, in New Orleans, Louisiana. Police later stopped the fire after most of the papers had been destroyed. This unidentified Japanese man turns to face a visitor at the Japanese consulate in Chicago on December 9, 1941. Clad only in underwear, he was startled while in the act of taking papers and files from a cabinet. Confidential papers at the consulate had been burned. Navy AP photo. Following Hawaiian tradition, sailors honor men killed during the December 7, 1941, Japanese attack on Naval Air Station Kania, Oahu. The casualties had been buried on December 8. This ceremony took place sometime during the following months.